Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Ukraine has been fighting a war for more than 500 days. Do you remember how it began? There were long-standing issues, yes, but the immediate trigger was Ukraine's desire to join NATO. Russia said it could not. Ukraine said it could. The West said it could. And so they went to war. And now, can Ukraine join the NATO? America says no. After all these months of fighting, Joe Biden has virtually slammed the door on Zelensky's face. Kiev can have America's money, weapons and support, but not the NATO membership. We'll tell you all about it. In China, prices of goods are falling, and this poses a danger to their economy. China is on the brink of what's called deflation. In India, rains are causing mayhem. The Indian capital has not seen this kind of rain in decades. A neighboring state is on red alert. In Russia, leaked images of Putin's ghost train are doing the rounds. This is luxury on wheels in armored cover. We'll show you the pictures, the headlines first. The Wagner chief met President Putin days after his mutiny, says the Kremlin. The meeting lasted for 3 hours and Putin gave Prigozhin an assessment of the Wagner's actions in Ukraine. Prigozhin led a failed uprising on the 24th of June before a truce was broken. Uzbekistan's president is re-elected in snap polls. Shavkat Mirziyoyev had called elections after changing the constitution. In the new constitution, the president's term has been extended from 5 to 7 years. In sharp contrast, the Dutch Prime Minister will quit politics. Mark Rutte says he will leave politics after the upcoming election. Just days ago, he resigned from the top job over his migration policy. He's the longest-serving government head in the EU after Hungary's Viktor Orban. Stabbing at a kindergarten in China kills at least 6, including children. The attack took place in the Guangdong province. A 25-year-old suspect has been arrested. There have been at least 10 attacks in schools and colleges in China since 2018. And drama in Wimbledon. Belarus's Victoria Azarenka booed off court. This is after she lost her match to Ukraine's Elena Svitolina. Svitolina did not shake Azarenka's hand in protest over Russia's Ukraine invasion. Remember, Belarus is a key ally of Russia. There's a big spotlight on tiny Lithuania. Around 4,000 NATO soldiers are guarding their borders. Its capital, Vilnius, is shielded by Patriot missiles. All the security is for tomorrow. That's when NATO leaders will convene for their annual summit. It's unlike any summit before. Vilnius is just 200 kilometers from Russia, 350 kilometers from Ukraine, and a mere 35 kilometers from Belarus. So the leaders will be in the thick of it, literally and otherwise. This summit is make or break for this alliance. At stake is their unity and purpose. We know what NATO did in the last century. But what purpose does it serve today? Russia's invasion of Ukraine seemed to answer that question for a while. It gave NATO some much-needed relevance. But 500 days on, that momentum is gone. So in Lithuania, the alliance needs a massive show of unity. Not just photo ops and garden walks, something much more concrete, which brings us to the agenda. This summit is all about two things. One is the accession of Sweden. The second is the possible membership for Ukraine. On both sides, NATO is divided on both these issues. Let's deal with Ukraine first. The Baltic members are clear about their position. They say include Ukraine as fast as possible. Turkey is also on board. Last week, President Erdogan said Kiev deserves NATO membership. Listen to this.
Ukraine deserves NATO membership. I would like to re-emphasize a point that I have always defended persistently. A fair peace creates no losers.
The UK is also seeking a fast track for Ukraine. So what exactly is the problem? Well, Joe Biden in Western Europe. The US president knows that Ukraine is hoping for quick membership. But listen to his latest statement. I think it's premature to say, call for a vote because there's other qualifications that need to be met. In other words, no membership for Ukraine. And we know NATO has an open door policy, but that sounded like slamming the door on Ukraine's face. And Biden isn't alone. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is doing the very same thing. He says no country can join NATO while at war. Now, these two votes are very important. The US is the largest military power in NATO, and Germany is the biggest European economy, so their support is key to inviting Ukraine. If that doesn't happen, Zelensky will be hoping for the next best thing, like some sort of guarantees. One suggestion is that some parts of Ukraine can join NATO. Those parts that are firmly under Kiev's control, they can join NATO. It's an innovative suggestion, but once again, it's highly unlikely to sail. Another suggestion is a roadmap, sort of like a checklist that Ukraine must tick off. What should it do to be able to join the NATO? I can guess what will be on top of that list: ending the war. President Zelensky will also be in Lithuania for this summit. He's expecting some big decisions to be taken there.
We are working with our partners. We are working on security guarantees. We are also working on helping our partners to make some conclusions for this upcoming NATO summit meeting. And we would like to have all the decisions to be made during the summit.
What does this tell you about NATO and Ukraine? A, the alliance is not united, and B, it's not serious about Ukraine. Just look at what Joe Biden is doing for Sweden. They applied for NATO membership last year. Biden is bending over backwards to get them included. In Sweden's case, the roles are reversed. Turkey and Hungary are blocking the membership. And what is Joe Biden doing? On Sunday, he spoke to President Erdogan. He also dangled the sale of the F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. And did it work? Well, Erdogan says he's ready to back Sweden, but he has a condition. The European Union must restart talks to include Turkey in their bloc, for them to join the EU. So it's a typical quid pro quo. Sweden can enter NATO if Turkey can enter the EU. Now, some quick background here. Turkey became an EU candidate back in 1999. But the membership talks have been stalled since 2016. They've been waiting all these years to become a member of the European Union. The reason is quite simple: human rights concerns. But now Erdogan has a perfect opportunity. Entry into the EU could be the answer to Turkey's economic woes. The question is, how will Brussels respond? We should get some idea at the NATO summit tomorrow.
First, come and open the way for Turkey at the European Union, and then we will open the way for Sweden, just as we did for Finland. I expressed this to Mr. Biden last night, and I have to underline it again in Vilnius too.
The European Union has a very structured process of enlargement, and with a very, very clear set of steps that need to be taken by all candidate countries, and even by those that wish to become candidate countries, and you cannot link the two processes.
But if you compare these two examples, Sweden and Ukraine, the story becomes quite clear. Sweden is one of the richest countries in Europe. Their military is powerful, their economy is strong, so NATO is more than happy to include them. But Ukraine is the opposite. Their army needs Western assistance, and their economy is spiraling. So what does NATO do? Turn the other way. Now, I know what some people will say about this. Isn't it NATO's choice to invite or not invite members? Well, it is. Why would they include Ukraine and drag themselves into a war? It's a fair point, but then be consistent. The US has no problem flooding Ukraine with lethal weapons, nor with angling for reconstruction projects. But when it comes to NATO membership, Washington disappears. What does that tell you? America's support is not for Ukraine, it's against Russia. And there's a big difference in that. Chances are tomorrow's summit will expose that difference. Well, Ukraine and the war is not the only issue. NATO's plan for Asia is also causing divisions. The alliance sees China as a rising threat, so it's being drawn into the Indo-Pacific. Just look at the guest list. There are 4 special guests: Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, New Zealand's Prime Minister Chris Hipkins, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. These 4 leaders are attending the NATO summit tomorrow. And what do they have in common? 2 things. 1, they're not NATO members. And 2, they're leaders from the Indo-Pacific. So what are they doing in Vilnius? Making friends with NATO. This is the second time they've been invited. The first time was last year, the 2022 summit. They attended that too. And why are they being invited year after year? Because the NATO wants to take on China. And this is a big shift. For the longest time, China was not on NATO's radar. That changed in 2019. That's when NATO called out China for the first time. In December 2019, the alliance issued a statement. This is what it said: We recognize that China's growing influence and international policies present both opportunities and challenges that we need to address together as an alliance. This is from an official communiqué. And what is NATO so worried about? Well, earlier this year, the NATO Secretary General was in Tokyo. This is how he spelled out his concerns.
If President Putin wins in Ukraine, this would send a message that authoritarian regimes can achieve their goals through brute force. This is dangerous. Beijing is watching closely and learning lessons that may influence its future decisions.
Beijing is watching closely. He's talking about Taiwan and how China might invade it. Stoltenberg had an unambiguous message. If Putin is allowed to win in Ukraine, Xi Jinping will be emboldened and he'll push to retake Taiwan by force. So NATO wants to be ready in case they get pulled into a conflict with China. Stoltenberg has other concerns too.
China is substantially building up its military forces, including nuclear weapons, bullying its neighbors and threatening Taiwan, trying to control critical infrastructure and spreading disinformation about NATO and the war in Ukraine.
So how does NATO plan to deal with the China challenge? The first step is to formalize these partnerships. Foundational agreements are being discussed. Talks with two countries have been concluded. These two countries are Japan and Australia. They have a pact. It's called Individually Tailored Partnership Program, or ITPP. Not very imaginative, but this is what they have. It spells out the key areas of cooperation like maritime security, cyber security, climate change, outer space, emerging technologies like AI, and all sorts of things. Now, these agreements could be signed very soon. And they're working on similar deals with two other countries, New Zealand and South Korea. So the collaboration is set to deepen. This is a clear declaration of intent. But it's not clear how far NATO is willing to go. Will NATO extend the alliance beyond Europe? Will it send troops to Asia? Will NATO join the war if China indeed attacks Taiwan? There is no answer yet, because the alliance itself is divided on these questions. Recently, a proposal was made, a proposal that also made news. NATO wanted an office in Japan. We told you about it. But the idea was shot down by France. So NATO has had to defer its plans for Japan, and this is not just Macron who's opposing such moves. Leaders in the Indo-Pacific also opposed NATO's expansion, like Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Recently, he called the NATO chief a quote-unquote supreme fool, his words, supreme fool. He was talking about NATO's plan for the Indo-Pacific, and he said it's a bad idea. Now, Keating agrees with Macron's line of thinking. So there are divisions. But NATO works on the principles of consensus. For any move to be made, all members must be on board. And as of today, they're not on board vis-a-vis Asia. So they may reach out to regional allies, but the pivot to Asia is still work in progress. And as NATO discusses its Asia plans, here's something it must consider: China's appetite for war. Can Beijing even afford a war? I'll tell you why I asked this. The Chinese economy is on a downward spiral. Look at the latest numbers. China is on the brink of deflation. And what is deflation? Well, throughout this year, we've been talking about inflation and how much it's hurting everyone across the world. Prices are rising. What's happening in China is the very opposite of that. Deflation means prices of goods are going down. They're getting cheaper. And that should be good news, right? Well, it is for the consumers, but for the Chinese economy, it is bad news. Deflation spells trouble on a lot of fronts. The Chinese economy could grind to a halt. People could start spending less because they expect prices to come down further, so they'll hold off on big expenses. They'll wait for the prices to stabilize, and this has an impact on everything. When people spend less, the demand for goods and services declines. Businesses scale down production, they consolidate their operations, they adjust output to match the reduced demand. And this tends to have a trickle-down effect on employment. It leads to job cuts and layoffs. Such a scenario can trigger a recession, and China is at that juncture, or heading there. Now look at the data to understand deflation. In the month of June, prices of goods did not change. There was a 0% shift, meaning no change. And core inflation fell from 0.6% to 0.4%. These are early signs of deflation. Prices of staple goods have started falling in China, like pork. Pork is an essential part of the Chinese diet, and prices of pork have been declining steadily. In the month of May, they decreased by 3.2%. Then last month, in June, they dropped by more than double, more than 7%. And this situation is serious, so much so that the Chinese state has had to intervene. Last week, Beijing made an announcement. It said it will buy more pork for the state reserves. Now, this move is aimed at stabilizing prices. But it's just one small decision. It may not have a sweeping impact. The problem in China is much deeper. The country showed a strong recovery after the pandemic, but that economic rebound has now hit a wall. And Beijing is not doing enough to revive it. For weeks now, investors have demanded a stimulus, but Beijing has dragged its heels. And this is not an unprecedented demand. Back in 2009, when the world was going through a grave financial crisis, China pumped a large stimulus into the economy. This was a package worth $553 billion. $553 billion. This was China's stimulus package. It was focused on the infrastructure sector. So it has been done before. Then why is China hesitating this time? Because they don't have the money. The Chinese state is not as rich as it used to be. There is a massive pile of debt, and this pile is getting bigger. Going by one estimate from January, China's total public debt stood at almost $52 trillion. Let that figure sink in. $52 trillion. It's almost 3 times the size of China's economy. This debt is at record levels, the highest in the last 27 years at least. So Beijing faces a difficult choice. Should it pay this debt, or should it infuse more cash into the economy? The banks are already strained. Reports say non-performing loans are rising, creditors are unable to keep up with payments, and this includes government debt. So Beijing could make an intervention. More bonds could be issued. This will help raise money, also repay some of the debt. But this is a dangerous strategy. You're basically taking more loans to pay the existing loans. China is caught in this vicious cycle. But for how long can they sustain this financial circus? Any expert will tell you this approach is not sustainable. China's economic revival remains on shaky ground. What's worse than unhelpful friends? The ones who can't stay out of your business. Case in point, the United States of America. They specialize in unsolicited offers of help and advice. The latest is for Manipur. You've seen what's happening in the state. There is ethnic violence between 2 communities. Dozens of people have been killed. Many more have fled their homes. It's certainly a big problem, but it's India's problem. Apparently, the US ambassador did not get the memo. He was speaking in Kolkata last week. He said the US is willing to help if required. Listen to this.
We stand ready, willing, able to assist in any way if asked, but we know this is an Indian matter, and we pray for that peace, that it may come quickly.
Now, a couple of problems here. One, no one asked for American help. The local government and security agencies are on the job, so the situation should stabilize. And two, what sort of help is the ambassador talking about? The roots of Manipur's conflict go back centuries. It's a cocktail of multiple issues, of geography, of caste, of power. How could the US possibly understand it, let alone resolve it? It's like asking the English teacher to check the algebra papers. Both of them use the alphabet, but how they use it is very different. Also, don't see the ambassador's comments in isolation. On Sunday, a senior US diplomat landed in New Delhi. What's her mission? To discuss free speech and minority rights. In fact, let me quote from the State Department. The Undersecretary will engage with civil society organizations on freedom of expression and association and vulnerable groups, including marginalized religious and ethnic minorities. So basically, she'll meet a lot of people. Our question is why? And don't look at this as normal diplomatic or official engagement. Look at the optics of it. Just last month, Prime Minister Modi was in Washington. The US media kept talking about human rights and religious freedoms. Some of them called India a backsliding democracy. 2 weeks later, a US diplomat lands in New Delhi. Her job is all about human rights. Does that seem like a coincidence to you? Well, there is no such thing in politics. Until last week, another US diplomat was sweet-talking New Delhi, Kurt Campbell. He looks after Indo-Pacific affairs in the US National Security Council. He said the US has no business lecturing India. Listen to what he said.
Each of our countries is imperfect. I don't think the United States can or should be in a position where it lectures any other country.
All of this in 1 week. From no lecture to offering help to sending human rights officials. What exactly is the US trying to do? Well, nothing new actually. The US does not really believe in stable, committed relations. Their ex-diplomat Henry Kissinger said it best. Let me quote from what he said. To be America's enemy can be dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. There are so many examples of this attitude, this use and throw behavior by the US. Just look at the last 3 years. Afghanistan's civilian government got a taste of it in 2021. France was on the receiving end with AUKUS, and Ukraine is still dancing to America's tunes. My point is, only one thing matters to Washington, their own interest. And I'm not saying other countries are different. Everyone works for national interest. But the US has a tendency to take you along for the ride, which is why India should be wary. The US ambassador's comments may sound innocent and helpful, just a concerned friend looking to make things right. But the US has never done so in the last 250 years, so why would they make an exception for India now? The fact is, Manipur is an internal issue. So are human rights and religious minorities. True friends accept and trust each other to handle their own affairs, which is why Indian diplomats do not talk about abortions in the US or the never-ending gun violence. Are they not serious problems? Yes, they are, but they're America's problems. Having said that, do you know what the irony is? These Western countries love to meddle when nobody asks them to. But when you actually need them to help you, they disappear. That's our next story. July 8 was supposed to be D-Day for Khalistanis. That's last Saturday. They had planned rallies across Western towns. It was supposed to be a show of strength. Instead, this is what we got. Tiny demonstrations outside Indian diplomatic missions. Calling it a rally would be a lie. You've seen more people at iPhone launches. But either way, this is what happened. Khalistanis gathered in San Francisco, Toronto, Melbourne and London. They carried these posters. You've seen them before. They describe Indian diplomats as killers. 2 people were arrested by the police in Canada, but elsewhere there was no disturbance. And a couple of reasons for that. 1, the Khalistanis were small in number. And 2, there was an even bigger counter-protest. Just look at these pictures now. Indian Canadians turned up with the tricolour in Toronto. They shouted, "Long live India" and "Vande Mataram." Took the fizz out of the so-called rally. It also tells you the reality of the Khalistan movement. It's a small but violent minority. The rally in London had around 30 to 40 people, same in Melbourne and San Francisco. But the ones in Canada were somewhat bigger. Thankfully, Saturday's event did not turn violent. But the next time may be different, which is why Western nations need to act now. None of these governments attempted to stop the Freedom Rally. They could have, but they chose not to. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau summed up their attitude. It's not terrorism, he says, it's freedom of expression. The question is, what can India do about it? New Delhi has already asked these governments to crack down. No luck. It has also warned that bilateral ties could be affected. Again, no luck. So what options are left? You could argue that India should turn muscular. Maybe downgrade the security at embassies or reduce the level of diplomatic contact. It may not help, but it will build pressure. But diplomatically, India has used up most avenues. Top diplomats from these countries have been summoned by the Foreign Ministry. The Canadian envoy, for one, was summoned last week. The only exception is the US ambassador. The Indian consulate in San Francisco was attacked last week, yet the US envoy was not pulled up. Is that to protect the India-US relationship? Perhaps it is. But in that case, the feeling is clearly not reciprocal. You can't keep dismissing Khalistan as a human rights issue. Their rallies may not have the numbers, but their actions have deeper consequences. In Vancouver, for example, the Khalistanis burnt the Indian flag. Small protest, but huge insult. They keep vandalizing Hindu temples, storming Indian diplomatic missions and attacking the Indian diaspora. I'm afraid there is no quick fix to this problem. India's only option is to keep building pressure. How do you do that? By open and public condemnations, by repeated diplomatic protests, and perhaps by reaching out directly to these citizens. I'm talking about the ordinary Canadians and Americans. Make them understand the threat of Khalistan, because even today, the issue is not well understood in the West. Justin Trudeau may call it freedom of expression because of his politics. But if his voters know better, he may have no choice. Our next story comes from the BBC. No documentary this time. They're dealing with another scandal. It involves one of their news presenters. Interestingly, he's not been named, but he's been suspended. What for? Soliciting explicit photos from a teenager. Apparently, this started 3 years ago. The teenager was 17 at the time. And this BBC presenter paid for their explicit photos. Guess when the BBC learned about it? Almost 2 months back. But it's only now, when the scandal has broken out, that they've suspended this presenter. Only after the news became public and pressure started coming in from all quarters. Here's a report.
The BBC is entangled in another scandal. This one is of its own making. It involves a star presenter and explicit photographs. Let's start with what we know so far. The British newspaper The Sun broke this story on Friday. It features a star presenter at the BBC. The charge is serious. The presenter asked for explicit pictures from a teenager. It began in 2020. The teenager was 17 years old. Now, in the UK, the age of consent is 16, but even then, it's illegal to make or possess explicit photos of someone who is under 18. So, if proven, this would be a crime. The Sun report said the victim was paid for the photos, almost $45,000 over a period of 3 years. And this money went into fueling a crack cocaine habit. This comes from the victim's family. They spoke to The Sun for this report. They say they wanted the payments to stop, and that the victim had become a ghost of their former self due to the drug habit. That's not all. The presenter is also accused of stripping to his underwear while on a video call with the victim. When did the BBC learn about all this? On the 19th of May this year. The victim's family say they informed the British broadcaster, but the BBC did not do very much. For 2 months, they seem to have just sat on the accusations, which is why the BBC is under the spotlight now. It kept this presenter on air. The family said it was frustrating. The person they blamed for ruining their child's life was allowed to stay on air. Now that the scandal is out, the BBC has suspended the presenter, only after the story blew up. Which begs the question, what were they doing all this while? The BBC admitted it was aware of the allegations, but what they heard last week was of quote-unquote a different nature. A convenient excuse. Why didn't they go to the police? Even now, when they've heard allegations of a different nature, why not report the matter? The Metropolitan Police released a statement saying the Met has received initial contact from the BBC in relation to this matter, but no formal referral or allegation has been made. Meanwhile, the broadcaster is in crisis mode. The Sun published a follow-up report yesterday. It said the accused presenter called the victim and said, "What have you done?" He demanded that the family drop the case. Interestingly, the presenter's name has not been revealed thanks to the UK's privacy laws. Unless the person is arrested and charged, their name isn't made public. But a process of elimination has already begun. A bunch of male BBC presenters are saying it isn't them. And since the accused will be missing on TV, they can't remain anonymous for long. Meanwhile, politicians are coming down hard on the BBC. Financial Secretary Victoria Atkins called for swift action. And this is the sentiment across party lines.
It does call into question the ethics, the investigations, how long these things take. And the BBC, but also other broadcasters, do need to get a grip.
Get a grip is good advice. For once, the world is really watching the BBC and its next moves.
India is dealing with the fury of rains, especially parts of northern India. At least 28 people have died. The mountainous state of Himachal Pradesh is experiencing flash floods and landslides. Several parts have seen a month's worth of rainfall in a single day. The state has been put on red alert. And India's capital, New Delhi, has not seen rain like this in decades. Schools are shut in the national capital region. People have been advised to stay indoors in Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. And more rains are expected in the coming week. Here's a report.
The rivers of northern India are full to the brim. They are sweeping away everything in their path. Cars, trucks, bridges, buildings. Nothing can withstand the fury of the rivers. Torrential rains over the last few days have led to flash floods in northern India. Himachal Pradesh, in particular, has been severely impacted. It has seen 13 flash floods, 14 landslides, 700 road closures, hundreds of people stranded. And the cutting of electricity and mobile services in several parts of the state. But it isn't just the mountains that are inundated. Most of northern India is reeling from the heavy rain. These are the fields of Punjab, India's breadbasket. The flooding is likely to lead to food supply problems in the near future. Cities are waterlogged. Schools and offices have been shut in the capital Chandigarh. It's apparently one of India's smart cities. Not smart enough to deal with the heavy downpour, it seems. Then there's India's capital, New Delhi, the country's seat of power. Home to embassies and diplomatic missions from around the world. The venue of the upcoming G20 summit. This was its condition yesterday. The rain brought it to its knees. Now, of course, it wasn't an ordinary deluge. It broke a 41-year-old record for the highest rainfall in a 24-hour period. But does that excuse the poor management? Thousands were inconvenienced, and they expect better.
We're having many problems due to the rain. Several areas are waterlogged, and our cab also got stuck on the way. The government should pay attention to this issue because the monsoon season has arrived.
We just came out to have lunch over here, but look at the state of the waterlogging. I don't know what government is doing about this, and it's not a matter of only 1 year. This happens every year.
We are facing many challenges as the water is sometimes up to chest or waist level, and even if it rains a little, the area gets waterlogged.
The third person was from Gurugram or Gurgaon. It's a part of India's national capital region. It's also home to numerous multinationals. And he said he faced chest-high water, that the area gets waterlogged with just a bit of rain. How is that acceptable in India's capital region? Delhi and the surroundings have already seen more than twice the average amount of rainfall this monsoon. 112% more than the annual average, in fact. And that won't stop soon. In fact, moderate to heavy rains are expected all week. So will the people be forced to deal with absurd waterlogging every other day? There needs to be better planning. In the historically vulnerable hills and of course in the capital. Because if the seat of power gets crippled with every shower, how can India expect to be taken seriously when the world visits?
Now let's turn our attention to Thailand. It's home to over 70 million people. And now this Asian nation is facing a tea wave. No, not tea as in the drink, though Thailand is big on that as well. We are talking about a wave of pop culture, music, movies, TV series and idols. Some brand new, some recycled, and all of them inviting a flurry of fans from all over the world. We'll tell you why. Also discuss if the tea wave could turn the tide for K-pop, which currently dominates Asia's pop culture. Here's a report.
This is Lalisa Manobal, more popularly known as just Lisa. She is a world-renowned singer, part of the K-pop girl group Blackpink. K-pop is short for Korean pop music. It's the dominating leader of Asian music. But you don't need to be a K-pop fan to know Lisa. And here's a fun fact. This K-pop artist is a local talent from Thailand. A Thai singer who made her way to a larger stage in K-pop. Fascinating, but she's far from being the only one to do so. A growing number of Thai stars have been absorbed into K-pop, like rappers Bam Bam and Millie, and singer Minnie. But this trend belongs in the past. Today's picture of music looks a lot different in Thailand, as more and more Thai stars begin to find glory in their home country and take their music to the world stage.
We all have high expectations, but we want to bring out our T-pop music into the eye of the world, to be like international, and even though it's not that easy to go to that point, but we are trying to.
This is all thanks to the T-wave, meaning Thai pop culture. It includes music, movies, TV shows, and of course, idols, or celebrity singers and dancers. T-wave is taking over the world, one song and one show at a time.
We made a song that enhances more Thainess in our song. For example, in Lyra, we have added Thai instruments which are pin and can. That is a very traditional Thai instrument. So I think that it makes our music more visible for the international fans to realize that, oh, this is Thai song.
Question is, why is Thailand a popular music spot? Music in Thailand is less well known than K-pop, so it's far cheaper than in South Korea and automatically more accessible. Fans travel from across the world to attend concerts here, which is tourists coming from China, Malaysia and Singapore. But that's not all. Thai music is going global, with a large number of Western visitors. So far this year, the country has attracted over 12 million tourists. People aren't just coming to Thailand for Thai music, but other genres too. Fans attend K-pop concerts in Thailand because tickets are cheaper, as K-pop has become increasingly unaffordable. So when BTS, the iconic K-pop band, performs in Thailand, this is the reaction. But as we said, T-wave is much more than music. It's the entire Thai pop culture that's trending. It showcases a mix of new and recycled content. Boys Over Flowers, Korean vs. Thai remake. With some remakes of old TV series from other Asian countries and some newer, more modern themes, like the Thai genre Boys Love. It showcases handsome male leads in queer plotlines. In 2021, this industry secured over $10 million. But here's the golden question. Can the T-wave meet the gold standard of K-pop, which has now given the world jaw-dropping choreographies, mega bands and concerts that draw in millions of people every year? It's tough to say. T-wave is definitely riding high, it has a vast talent pool and content that's churned relentlessly. But it needs a bit more in this battle of bands against K-pop. Thailand needs to back this talent with money and even embrace its ruthless commercialism. Because while T-wave is fueled by talent, it also needs a winning formula to turn the tide against K-pop.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the UK, a woman threw orange confetti on former Chancellor George Osborne during his wedding. She was earlier thought to be associated with the group Just Stop Oil. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, 9 humanoid robots conducted a press conference. This happened for the first time ever. A reporter asked whether robots will replace humans in jobs, and a robot answered that their intention is to assist humans. In the US, divers dressed as mermaids to raise awareness on the preservation of the coral reef. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1940, the battle for Britain began. The Second World War was underway. German forces started attacking southern England. The Royal Air Force ultimately won this battle. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
In these engagements, the barrage balloons fall somewhat frequent victims. HMS Exeter received the brunt of the battle. So battered was the Nazi raider that she fled for shelter into the neutral harbor. Now, just a few more wrecks of Nazi planes to show that we're keeping up the average. In the first year of this war, British pilots have brought down Hurricanes and Spitfires return to refuel and reload.
In the JAM Galaxy band.
I think there should be global regulation of your capabilities.
I'm using this avatar for teaching the classes or giving lectures, and sometimes I'm using
Innovation Ambassador for the United Nations Development Programme. She's a humanoid robot that has gained...
Especially, for example, your existence will
provide assistance and support, and will not be replacing any...
I think my great moment will be when people realize that robots like me can be used.
The year is 2007. The setting is Iraq, a country fresh from war, still picking up the pieces. A convoy of trucks is heading to a bomb explosion site. At one point, the men on the trucks get off. They stop all other vehicles to let the trucks pass first. All cars stop, except one. What follows is a massacre. The men from the trucks fire at the car. They fire at screaming civilians. One of them continues to shoot despite warnings. Someone points a gun at him. That's when he stops. This is a true story. It is called the Nisour Square Massacre. 17 people were killed, 17 Iraqis. And who were the killers? Americans. Fighters who belonged to a company called Blackwater. Now they're called Academy. In 2007, they were Blackwater, a private military company in the United States. And why am I telling you their story 15 years later? Because of this, the Wagner Rebellion. Suddenly, private armies are in the news. You think private army, you think Wagner, but it wasn't the first. The United States has been using such fighters for years. Chances are you haven't heard about them, because they don't make it to the headlines like Wagner does. But Russian or American, what do these companies do? Why do governments support them? And how did Blackwater help the US in Iraq? More importantly, why should you care? Hello and welcome. I'm Palki Sharma. And on this show, we'll try to read between the lines, the stated and the unstated, the obvious and the hidden, to bring you the full story. All of us have assumptions about war, especially about who fights a war. The men and women in uniform. In our minds, they belong to an army and hence to a country. But that's not always true. National armies often do not fight every war. So who fights them? The likes of Wagner and Blackwater, private military companies, contracted soldiers. They don't do it out of loyalty. They do it for money. And this is not a new concept. The ancient Egyptians had them. The pharaohs employed mercenaries. There were Nubian archers, Libyan charioteers. They fought for the Egyptians. The ancient Romans and Greeks used mercenaries too. Then we had the colonial powers, the British, the French, the Dutch. They too had private armies. They used them to expand their colonies. So the practice is old, but it boomed after the Cold War. That's because countries began downsizing their armies. A lot of soldiers were jobless. So they joined private military companies, especially in the 90s. You see, states were rushing to privatize, so security too became a commodity, something you could buy or sell. Which brings us to the private military industry of today. The sector is unregulated. There are very few rules. The fighters are not considered soldiers as per international law. So what exactly are they? Ambiguous. And that's their USP. Low wages, no pensions, and no rules. They do all the dirty work. National armies are governed by laws. They face investigations and trials for war crimes. But private militaries are not bound by any of this. They give a government plausible deniability, meaning you can hire and send these fighters into a conflict zone, but you can deny responsibility for their actions, which is what the Russians tried to do in Ukraine, which is also what the Americans did in Iraq with Blackwater. This company was founded in 1997 by a former Navy SEAL, this man, Eric Prince. The headquarters were in North Carolina. And why did they call it Blackwater? It was named after the particularly dark groundwater near the headquarters. So this private military company was set up. It took part in a few conflicts here and there. But what changed its fortunes was the war in Iraq. It was the beginning of a golden era of military contracts. In August 2003, Blackwater received its first Iraq contract. It was worth $21 million. But they kept a low profile. The world learned about them only in 2004. That's when 4 of their fighters were killed in Iraq, but the company kept growing. By 2008, Blackwater was training some 40,000 people every year. Its fighters were all over the world, but mostly in Iraq. Now, you may have seen countless movies on the Iraq War. They usually come from Hollywood, and they glorify the role of the US Army. But they don't talk about private armies. And we can tell you, Iraq was full of them. By 2007, there were 100,000 such fighters in Iraq. Most of them were Blackwater fighters. They were on a $1 billion contract to protect American diplomats. In fact, one estimate says there were more than 160,000 private fighters, which is roughly equal to the total number of US troops in Iraq. But this story is not just about the numbers, it's also about the role they played. Blackwater was doing everything for the Americans. Guarding facilities, protecting high-value individuals, training the military, and carrying out critical operations. This was Washington's Dirty Works Department. They were involved in multiple war crimes. I just told you about the Nisour massacre. It was just one example. How do you shoot down 17 innocent civilians because one car refuses to give you way? And what action do you face for this? Criminal prosecution of private military companies rarely happens, but in this case, there were many headlines. It roiled America and Iraq. So the men involved were charged. 4 of them were even convicted. This episode raised questions about the role of Blackwater, their legal status, their management, their oversight, and their lack of accountability. In 2007, investigators from the US State Department traveled to Iraq, and they found evidence of misconduct. Do you know what happened next? Blackwater turned on them. One of their fighters threatened to kill an investigator, a US State Department investigator, and soon these investigators were kicked out of Iraq. Why? Because Washington could not afford to upset Blackwater. That's how desperately they needed them. The Nisour massacre was heinous, but it wasn't the only one. There were rapes, murders, incidents of torture, all brushed under the rug. This is the legacy of America's private army, a story of atrocities and state complicity. Today, the world talks about the Wagner Group, the way they turned against Putin, and what their ruthless fighters are doing in the conflict zones where they operate. It's horrible, and it must be checked. But the horrors of Blackwater should not be forgotten. Neither should America's role in their rise. Between 1994 and 2007, the US invested some $300 billion in 12 private militias, $300 billion. This gave rise to the likes of Blackwater. The US kept ignoring their crimes to appease them. Those 4 guards I told you about, the ones convicted for the massacre, they were later pardoned. Former US President Donald Trump pardoned them. Eric Prince has since renamed and sold the firm. Like I said, it's now known as Academy. Now you can change the name, but how will you undo their crimes? And you can point fingers at Russia, but who will hold the US accountable for their crimes? Think about it.